The following is a conversation with Dr. Silvia, professor in the School of International Service at American University, expert in international economics, especially tariffs and relationships with Latin America. We discuss tariffs which are coming as of today and their impact on American economy. We also discuss the relationship between Europe and US and the changing landscape of multilateral world from the domination of US to regional superpowers. If you enjoy it, please subscribe, like, share, and if you really, really like it, there is a Patreon in the description.
Hello, Professor Silvia. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this podcast. I'm super excited about discussion on tariffs as they are coming now, and we'll see the consequences. So let's start with that. Let's dig in right away. Why everybody I talk to think that tariffs will not be beneficial for economy, but rather will be very negative?
Yeah, so tariffs have been something that have been used for a very long time, and all countries still use tariffs. So there are virtually no countries that have zero tariffs. But the discussion is about doing a substantial increase in tariffs. And the reason why most people are critical of tariff increases is because, first of all, it's a tax that's placed on consumers. And second of all, it undercuts efficiency for any economy when you introduce tariffs.
I understand that because basically when you are bringing products from outside, you, the consumer, are paying the tax, additional tax which was taken from the importer at the border. However, the question is so this is well understood, everybody understands it. The question is if this tax can be compensated or equalized in two ways. The first one would be reduction in income tax, and the second one would be if the company who is producing that product, which is now tariffed, opens production in the US. I think this is the view or belief that it will happen of the current administration. So what is your opinion about this?
To understand why most economists don't support tariffs, you have to go way back to David Ricardo and what David Ricardo wrote over 200 years ago. And essentially, it still holds. And what David Ricardo wrote when he talked about comparative advantage is that countries benefit by specializing in what they do best in relative terms. Now, it's on the one hand, it's very easy to confuse this with just being competitive. And that's not the insight of David Ricardo. What David Ricardo said is, you should do what you as a country does best, specialize in it, even if you're not the best in the world, because then you create the greatest amount of value that your country can produce. And then you take whatever you produce best and then go out and trade, and then you can get what you need. So when you start implementing tariffs, you start breaking down that specialization. You make it no longer possible to have specialization. And therefore, you produce less material goods, and you therefore have less to acquire in order to maximize your standard of living. Now, about 40, 50 years ago, economists like Paul Krugman added to this, and they brought in another idea, which is economies of scale. And not in every business, but in many, like the ones that are talked about, automobiles, computers, things like that, the more you produce of something, the lower you can charge for each unit you sell. So if you start putting on tariffs, you begin to reduce those economies of scale. The prices of goods go up, people have to pay more for them. So those are like the core fundamental insights on why liberalized trade benefits countries, regardless of whether you're the top producer of something or not.
That makes sense under the condition that everybody is operating under free trade and there is no government subsidies for any of these products, right? Because that artificially lowers the production cost. But for example, China is heavily subsidizing a lot of their production, therefore they are lowering the cost kind of artificially. That would be the first counter argument as a non-economist. Maybe you can counter it, maybe you say that this doesn't matter or it's not true. And the second argument is the pandemic. So during the pandemic, we discovered that a lot of supply chains were broken because of the pandemic, and countries became suddenly less interested in global trade and more interested in self-preservation. And we had situations when we didn't have enough masks, we didn't have enough antibiotics, or we didn't have enough toilet paper for a while, as I remember. So that basically seems to work for a peacetime, but the free trade, completely free trade in the time of conflict seems to be breaking.
So I'll tackle both of those. I'll do them one at a time. First, I'll talk about subsidies. The typical point that economists will make, Milton Friedman made this point a long time ago, is saying that if somebody wants to sell you something for below the cost of making it, you should buy it. So if you went into a store and you wanted to buy, I see you got guitar back there, and if somebody wanted to sell you that guitar for, let's say, $200, the person would be crazy to sell that guitar for $200, and you would be smart to buy it. So the general argument is if somebody wants to sell you something for cheaper than it costs, you benefit from that. However, the points that you made about the pandemic and others will make about national security, other issues, supply chains, those are equally valid points. And so at the level of an individual, you'd always want to pay the lowest price. For a country, leaders of the country do have to keep in mind this question of vulnerability. And that can be a vulnerability for mundane things like toilet paper, for more important things like personal protective equipment during a pandemic, or military reasons. So there can be reasons for countries to look at things and say, yeah, I could get something for a cheaper price, but I really need to make sure that my security is preserved. Now, there's another thing that economists have brought up around the issue of trade, and that is just disruption in general. That it's been typical for economists to say, yeah, we should do free trade, and yes, we'll have specialization, and yes, some people will lose their jobs, but if the government steps in, compensates those people for their job loss, that we'll end up on the whole better off. And the thing that economists have been writing about recently have been recognizing that, for example, with when China entered the World Trade Organization, that the disruption that caused in places in the upper Midwest in the United States and elsewhere, that the adjustment to a factory closing down is a lot more difficult and traumatic for that community than economists had acknowledged. So the idea of slowing or doing a much better job of compensating for trade adjustment is something that economists have recognized more and more recently. Some countries like Denmark do an excellent job of precisely that adjustment. They do a much better job than the United States because they involve local employers, they involve the local trade unions, and they really spend the money to allow for a smooth adjustment. Now, the United States has not done that. But when it comes to tariffs, tariffs are like running this experiment in reverse. That with things like NAFTA, now the USMCA, the US Canada Mexico Free Trade Agreement, that we have had all those adjustments for 30, 40 years. And what Donald Trump is proposing to do is disrupt the economy, cause a lot of joblessness by all of a sudden cutting off suppliers that people have had and offering absolutely no government support to have adjustment to running this experiment in reverse. So it will come with all the disruption, none of the expanded economies of scale. So it really will be a damaging thing to do to the economy of the United States.
So, two questions to follow up on this. First of all, why is government responsible to adjust or pay compensate people who lost jobs because private company decided to move factory to China? That feels like this is responsibility of this private company, or at least to a degree. And second, or maybe added benefit of that, like some kind of form of tax on that company. Because if government is responsible, then that just increases the debt, right? The second question related to that is if tariffs are entirely disruptive for economy and will, as you say, result in a job loss on all jobs related to that imported goods, like assembly or anything like this, which is the case, they act against business and against workers. They have both negative, from this view, negative impact. So why would administration do that? It's what is the counter argument, if you can, because I don't know the counter argument. Why would they all do that? The only one I heard is, well, we'll lower the income tax. Is that sufficient? And why would you do that if both big business will lose on it and if people will lose their jobs? What is the argument to do that?
Sure. So when you look at tariffs, there are beneficiaries from tariffs. The beneficiaries from tariffs are the domestic industries that sell whatever the product is. If they make that product principally in the United States, for example. So a big proponent of tariffs is the U.S. steel industry, and they will benefit. In fact, the Trump administration has already enacted tariffs, and the steel industry in the United States has already raised their prices. So tariffs allow domestic companies to raise their prices. They are the big beneficiaries. And it's not just the companies, the businesses that are the beneficiaries. It is the workers too, because the company can now increase wages. So those are the people who benefit, the producers, both business and workers. But the people who, the question of taxes on what tariffs do, that tariffs themselves are a tax. And the administration is saying that over 10 years that the United States government would collect $6 trillion worth of taxes. Well, that's a tax on the American people, the people who are buying those products. So you may be able to lower the income tax, but the reason why you'd be able to lower the income tax is because you're taxing the consumers buying the foreign goods. So if you're doing that, you're not really lowering taxes. You are just shifting taxes around. And tariffs are regressive taxes. Poorer people pay a higher share of their income on tariffs than wealthy people. So shifting from the income tax to the tariffs is shifting from a more progressive form of taxation to a more regressive form of taxation.
That is excellent point. Does it work in your mind similarly to sales tax? So, for example,
Yes.
in Europe, there is VAT tax, which is in Poland, for example, 23%. That would be more or less equivalent of a tariff of 25%, which administration is putting on people. So, would that be equivalent, or sales tax is more severe because it's on the end product?
Yeah, so it would be like a sales tax, and but it would be more like a value added tax, because every place where an input is being imported, that element will be taxed. It'll only fall on imported products, however. So for example, for automobiles, for steel imported from Canada to the United States to make automobiles, the tax will be put on that, the tariff, and that will go into the price of the car.
Is there any lowering of income tax that would fully compensate for the cost of the tariffs for people who pay less income tax? So I can imagine that people who pay a lot of income tax, like upper middle class, let's say, who still pay, because the billionaires don't pay taxes, usually income taxes that much, but let's say upper middle class, like doctors, lawyers, I think for them maybe it's possible to calculate that for this group, the tariffs are less costly than if they income tax was reduced to zero, let's say. But first of all, is it possible?
I mean, during the presidential campaign, a number of economists ran models estimating what would be the net impact on families if Donald Trump did what he said at the time, in terms of implementing a tariff. And the estimates were anywhere between $2,000 per family to $4,000 per family per year that they would have in additional expenses as a result of tariffs. Now, the tariffs, Donald Trump, as we all know, has not been consistent with what the tariffs would be. We still don't know today, the day before, exactly what the tariffs will be that he's talking about implementing on April 2nd. So one would have to do a new model. The one thing I would say is that he's talking about a higher set of tariffs than he did during the campaign. So one would anticipate the costs would be higher. Now, to your question of how that would play out vis-a-vis income taxes, there are a few things. One, it all depends on how they would structure any sort of income tax reductions, and they haven't spelled that out in any way. So it's very hard to, we really don't have the information to make that estimate. The other thing that many people have pointed out is that this $6 trillion of revenue is based on an inconsistent premise, because it's based on continuing the exact same volume of imports that we have now. But if we have tariffs on those imports, the prices of those products will go up, which means the volume that we would import would go down. The other thing is the Trump administration has been arguing that implementing the tariffs would lead to a revival of U.S. industry. Well, if that were the case, then we would import less. So the revenue from imports, tariff revenue from imports would go down. So there's a lot of inconsistent mathematics involved in what the administration has been saying.
So it's basically one big experiment, because we can't estimate, like we are saying, we will get revenue from tariffs in the Department of External Revenue, I think it's called, something like this, right?
Yeah.
The new one, and then, we also at the same time are trying to lower the imports to produce locally. So that means automatically that the income from tariffs, the revenue from tariffs, will be lowered.
Exactly.
And so this is one big economical experiment, whether this can be balanced for the benefit of people, or it can destroy the economy completely. And the big premise belief there is that at the end of the day, philosophical kind of belief that this country can be self-sustained in a sense, right? Because that means that if everything could be produced cheaper inside the country, that could work. But we know that's not possible, that everything would be produced inside the country. That's unlikely in the 21st century. So that's one of the biggest problems, right? Do I understand it
Right.
correctly?
Well, the U.S. could produce most everything inside the country, but it would be very expensive. So the United States could produce T-shirts inside the country, but we would be paying, substantially more for T-shirts. And the other thing about it is, if when you specialize, you have people working in high value added jobs. So if you don't specialize and you try to produce everything at home, then you'll have people making T-shirts and other low value added jobs. So they're going to get lower pay. So it doesn't help really advance the incomes of particularly people at the lower end of the pay scale by taking these steps. One thing that I think is worth noting is the temptation to do this has been widespread, and it's been there for a long time. It seems to make sense to do something like this. And in fact, in the 1970s, many countries in Latin America experimented with doing a very similar thing. And even some countries in Asia, it was called import substitution industrialization, that you would, substitute your imports, you'd build up the industry yourself, and then you'd have an industry. But this really had disastrous results in Argentina, in Brazil, in other countries. And by the time those countries got to the 1980s and 1990s, they abandoned that experiment. And countries in East Asia abandoned that experiment. Korea tried that in the 1960s, and it didn't work. So Korea then switched to export promotion. So this experiment, we've seen it, it's failed time and time again. But there's a bit of nationalism and the temptation to say we can do it all better. And so it's something that can be very attractive and seductive to politicians and voters. But boy, do we have an awful lot of evidence that it just doesn't work.
Yeah, not only that, it's against the laissez-faire economics, the basics, the free trade economics to have any tariffs, right? So it seems but to counter this argument, as I said, I'm not an economist, but there is many countries that have very high tariffs and don't remove them. So one example would be Brazil, actually, who has 100% tariffs on electronics. I experienced it personally because I wanted to buy for a friend a laptop when I was living there for a while, and it was 100% tariff. In India, there are 100% tariffs. Europe tariffs, American cars and American products, very, very high. If tariffs are derogatory for economy, why when many countries have such a high tariffs, what is their argument?
So, a couple of things on that are to the point that you talked about in the beginning about why doesn't the U.S. have tariffs as high as other parts of the world? And the answer is way back when the post-war trade regime was established back in the late 1940s. The United States took a position that it was not going to try to force all the countries in the world to have the exact same tariff structure, because that just would have been too difficult to negotiate. So the position instead was countries should, whatever their tariffs are, start with those tariffs. And the whole post-war structure, which eventually became the World Trade Organization, was set up to lead all countries to negotiate reductions of their existing tariffs. And that slowly you would get a reduction of all tariffs. And if you had higher tariffs to begin with, that pace of reduction would be higher. And when you look at it, historically speaking, that is what happened. That tariffs in Europe came down, tariffs in the United States came down, tariffs even in Latin America and other parts of the world, they were on a downward trajectory. And there's been this discussion recently of reciprocal tariffs, that the United States would match whatever tariffs other countries had. Well, the problem with reciprocal tariffs is if you look at the classification of products for tariff schedules in general, there are a huge number of products. It's like 2.6 million. And you would have to do that for the 200 countries of the world which we trade with. And it would just be, a task beyond anybody's, capacity to accomplish. The other thing is, if you do reciprocal tariffs, you're basically not, you're basically giving up you deciding what you set tariffs on, and you're giving it to the other country, whatever the other country thinks is important and wants to set tariffs on. You're accepting their rate. So it would mean that if Brazil wants to set 100% tariff on electronics, that then you're going to set it at that level. So you're really losing any autonomy over setting tariffs in a way that would match your economy. And it's one of the reasons why in the last month, the administration, after floating the reciprocal tariffs idea, has been backing away from it, because they've recognized that both the capacity to do it is daunting, and you're really giving up tariffs as a strategic tool. Now, why countries set tariffs? There's two general reasons why countries will set tariffs. One is the strategic reason, and that is if you want to preserve certain industries for non-economic reasons, for non-efficiency reasons, but you want to preserve militarily important products, things like supply chains for medical products, then there's an argument that most economists readily accept, that is a political choice. You're sacrificing efficiency, but you're doing it for a reason to secure supplies. And that's a legitimate political, broader reason for having tariffs. The other reason economists are more critical of, and that is that interest groups lobby, they convince politicians that they deserve protection, and they get it. And economists are much more critical about that second reason why you have tariffs. A good example of that is the United States not only has tariffs, but has quotas, which are even a bigger departure from the market on sugar, on the importation of sugar. And that's basically because the domestic producers of sugar a long time ago were very effective in their lobbying. And now that the sugar quotas are in place, it's very difficult to remove them.
Sugar quotas sounds very scary to me because it sounds like planned economy, which I survived as a child
Yes.
communist. But let's look at two concrete examples, because I think I just realized something when you were saying that you completely convinced me about one thing. So, for example, this tariff on Brazilian tariff on electronics. I'm not sure if this is correct. It is exactly 100%. That needs to be fact checked. But let's say it is 100%. It's very high.
I think it's come down. It was
maybe.
very high in the 70s and 80s, and it's come. Brazil has made some steps toward liberalization, but yeah, their tariffs are still high.
So let's say it's high. So for Brazil to put on tariff on electronics, they will as they call it, they will generate. So they basically tax their people on buying electronics, because electronics are not produced in Brazil but outside. Brazil is not famous for producing iPhones, right?
Yeah.
So if there is a reciprocal tariff on electronics, US will make near zero money on Brazilian import of electronics, right? Because they would
Exactly.
not import anything,
Yeah.
and Brazil will make a lot of money. So the idea of this makes no sense to me. However, I will give a counter example, which is I own a Volkswagen, right? I live in the US. I own a Volkswagen because I like the look of it. I'm from Europe. I like European look of cars. And then I actually went to Poland for a while and wanted to bring an American car to Poland because it's popular, or was popular, to buy American car. I had to pay 35% tariff on that car. So that seems unequal because both in US and in Europe, there is a lot of car producers. So that ideally there should be no tariffs and there should be free competition on these cars. Whatever car is better should be sold. And yet somehow it is, as you said, it is post-war idea that countries set up their own tariffs. It seems to me that an average car factory employee in US is very upset if he thinks about it, that his salary and the amount of production he's doing suffers because he can't sell to China and to Europe. And that seems reasonable to be reciprocal in this particular sub-fragment, sub-market, right? So what do you think about that?
So that's a couple of points. One, just following up on Brazil, and then I'll take the car example that you gave. So back in the 80s, Brazil tried to develop a computer industry. And in fact, one of the things that I show in my class, there's this ad for this Brazilian computer that was called Orange Plus. And the idea was to compete with Apple. And so Brazil jacked up tariffs on computers and tried to sell this computer to the United States. It was not a very good computer and it never really took off and it doesn't exist anymore. So that is again sort of 1970s 80s import substitution style of production that just didn't work for Brazil. It was an effort, going beyond import substitution to export promotion. But it didn't work because Brazil just was not competitive in electronics to beat Apple or the other competitors at the time. Now, on the auto tariffs and other places where there are high tariffs on the U.S. Potential exports. This is where some people looking at the Trump administration were hopeful that the Trump administration's discussions about tariffs were bargaining leverage and that they were going to threaten to implement tariffs, but they really wanted something and weren't actually going to implement the tariffs. And it would be and for example, with the automobile industry, Mercedes executives and others said, look, why doesn't Europe lower its tariff on cars to the US rate of 2.5%? Then we would reduce this complaint, we'd eliminate this complaint of the United States, and we would avoid tariffs on our cars. And Europe, that was just a proposal from the CEO of Mercedes. It didn't happen, but it does not look like that Donald Trump is playing the game of bargaining chips. You can go back to the 1980s and see statements from Donald Trump as a New York, real estate mogul complaining about unfair trade in the United States being ripped off. So this is something that runs very deep in the views of Donald Trump and is long-standing. And in recent during the campaign, Donald Trump was talking about William McKinley as his role model as a president. And William McKinley did rely principally on tariffs. Not only he, but the presidents before him did. But it's important to recognize a couple of things with that. One, the federal government was much smaller. So the amount of money that the federal government needed to collect as a share of GDP to operate was 2.5% of GDP. The United States federal government now is more like more than 20% of GDP. So the second thing is that tariffs are one of the easiest taxes to collect. That you just put a big fence around your ports, you put big fences at your border crossing and at your airports nowadays, and you don't let people take out products until they pay the tariff. And in fact, this is why countries in Africa, a country like Pakistan, that are low state capacity countries and don't really have the capacity to collect income taxes in a very informal economy. Those economies rely much more heavily on tariffs because tariffs are one of the easiest taxes to collect. And that was true for the United States back, 150, 200 years ago as well. But it's no longer true. And that's, so the two reasons why, something you began with in the beginning, why income taxes have replaced tariffs is because governments have grown in what they provide, so they need more revenue to do it. And nowadays, if you're a more sophisticated economy, you can collect income taxes relatively easily. And one other thing I think is also involved is a policy choice, is income taxes are progressive. Tariffs are regressive. So if you want progressive taxes, then income taxes are better.
Mm-hmm. This is a very good point, but you mentioned something which I think is actually consistent with the current administration, which is you said that the tariffs are unlikely to provide similar level of income as income tax, and they are regressive. And with a larger government, we need more money to sustain all the services government provides. But I think it's very clear that the current administration is trying to reduce the government. So maybe the belief is that they are going to basically reduce it to the McKinley level. And by the way, that explains something. You know that Denali mountain, the highest mountain in US was changed. The name was changed back to
Yes.
McKinley. And I was thinking, why, like, what suddenly happened? Like, why would that be? And that explains it. If this is the tariff president, I didn't know that, then that explains that ideological stamp, right, on the
Yes.
mountain. We are introducing tariffs, therefore Denali is now McKinley.
The other thing,
yeah.
I would need to fully fact check this, but I believe that it's the case that William McKinley is the last president to add territory to the United States, when the United States took over the Philippines, and so I think part of Donald Trump's talk about Greenland and the Panama Canal, I think again is an effort to emulate William McKinley.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay, I need to increase my knowledge of past presidents.
McKinley was a Republican too, so.
It's funny enough, we are in McKinley building in
Yes,
American
yes.
University, so I should know more about McKinley. A little bit coming back to this tariff question. So, what is your prediction? If you can give prediction, first of all, we are talking on April 1st. April 2nd, the tariffs are possibly coming. You argue, and many people say that tariffs are no longer a bargaining chip, they are actually coming. We don't know. On April 2nd, 10 p.m., we might have tariffs removed for 3 days, or they might be liquidated on April 3rd. This is very unpredictable administration. Literally anything can happen. So it will be very interesting to watch that few days later, how much of this happened actually. But what do you think will be if tariffs are really implemented, as they are proposed right now. Well, we don't know yet exactly, but let's say this is almost 25% across the board. I've heard these kind of numbers. What do you think will be immediate reactions of markets? Do you see like macroeconomic reactions? Or what should we do? Should we buy gold immediately and sell all our stock because our retirement fund is going to be depleted? Or should we buy like, I'm not asking for advice on investment, but I'm saying what will happen macroeconomically?
Well, I wouldn't buy gold just out of principle, and gold is very high at this point. But gold, the other thing about gold is you don't get any interest out of gold, so you'd have to time it. But I think given gold is topped, is way up at its world record price, I wouldn't recommend buying gold. If I were economists are bad people to ask about the market because we can tell you what will happen over a 5-year time span or something like that, but we can't tell you what will happen next week. So with that caveat that you're better off talking to Wall Street people than economists about market, the one thing that I would say, if I were speculating in the market, I would look at, I said that producers benefit from tariffs. So you would look at the sectors that are they're still very much domestically based, and the ones that are now vulnerable to imports, they will benefit from the tariffs, and that's where you'd invest. But it can be misleading. I mentioned steel definitely benefits from tariffs, but automobiles, the domestic producers, as they are currently structured, it cuts both ways. So a company like General Motors gets a good share of what it sells from Mexico, that the final products are made in Mexico, and they have a decent amount made in Canada as well. So the implementation of tariffs would not necessarily benefit General Motors. And so many people have been looking at companies and like the 3 car companies, and they've been saying, well, General Motors and Stellantis, Stellantis owns Chrysler, and Ford, that General Motors and Stellantis get much more of what they produce from Mexico and Canada than Ford. So if tariffs were implemented, Ford would be relatively the winner of the U.S. car companies. So you'd have to do that sort of analysis and figure out who would be the winners and who would be the losers. So what economists generally do is they look at the macro picture and say, well, if we add up all those winners and losers, will the U.S. be worse off as a whole? And the answer is yes, that there'll be some producers like U.S. Steel, Cleveland Cliffs, who make steel, they'll be better off. But when you add it all up, it's going to be a net negative. Now, on the question of, is this still the strategic bargaining chip process, I think we will get some information. Across the board tariffs are not strategic, because you can't bargain with 200 some odd countries at once. So if they are placed on a handful of countries, then that would suggest that, yes, this is about bargaining. So if they're placed on the EU and let's say Korea and Japan and Canada and Mexico, then the question is, well, what does the U.S. want? The U.S. would have the capacity to bargain with that handful of countries. But if it's 200, no, then this is not a strategic exercise of offering tariffs, putting up tariffs in order to then take them down to get something else.
Well, I think also auto industry asked Trump to delay tariffs by 30 days exactly for that reasons, right? They
could happen. That could happen.
They couldn't just switch immediately. But you said something very interesting. You said that you can't predict the next 5 days, but you are comfortable as economists predicting the next 5 years. I love that. I love that. This is amazing, because usually the further into the future, the harder. So
Sure.
what do you think will happen? Can you give what do you think will happen? Like, what can we expect? A recession? Can we expect domestic production going up, more jobs or less jobs? What do you think? Is it even predictable, or it's just complete chaos? We don't know.
It's predictable. It all depends on what you put in. Um, and, one of the things that, sort of is economists like to say that the sky is going to fall in with the introduction of tariffs. But one has to look at the proportionality of things. It certainly will hurt the economy, but it's important to spell out exactly how. So and it's important to recognize a country like the United States, a continental wide economy, imports, about 16, 17% of what we consume. Is a share of if you look at it in terms of GDP. So that means it would be if it's 20%, it would be a 20% price increase on 17% of what is purchased. So when you think about that, that's 4 or 5% price increase of all goods and services. So that will affect things, but it's not going to be a massive cataclysmic thing that would unfold. The other thing is tariffs, they do have a second order effect in that it allows domestic producers to raise their price. So I already mentioned like the domestic steel companies have raised their price. So there'd be follow-on price increases that would happen with domestic producers having the room to raise prices. Many of them will. So it will spill out beyond that 17%. And so we'll get price increases, probably, maybe double that as far as the spread. So 35-40% of the economy, there'll be price increases.
That will be
And
inflation. Then that causes
so,
inflation.
yeah, there'll be
That's
inflation.
basically. Mhm.
So what this will mean is there'll be in the next coming year to 18 months, there will be an uptick in inflation that will be noticeable. And then once that works itself through year and a half, that price level will remain higher, but it'll be a one-time increase in the prices that will happen. So it's not like implementing tariffs will mean that inflation will go on for as far as the eye can see. It means there'll be a one-time significant increase in prices, 4 or 5%, um, and that'll last for a year and a half, and then it'll settle at those higher prices. So that's the likely scenario. So it isn't a second Great Depression. However, the longer run is more insidious, and that is we're going to have to live with those higher prices. It means U.S. companies that want to export, the prices of their goods will be higher, so they'll sell fewer. So the U.S. will become this high cost island and won't be able to export nearly as much as it may have otherwise. And will be, as I said, will be like Argentina and Brazil in the 1970s and 80s. Now, we do have a bigger market. Those countries had, 40 million or 100 million back then in a population. We've got 300 million. But it will lead to stagnation and of our economy, and it will damp down on innovation. The U.S. won't be as competitive as it otherwise could be.
So that's pretty bleak view on the long term, right? And in
Yeah.
medium term too. And do you think this could be countered by lowering the value of the dollar versus other currencies and lowering the interest rates? That's the arguments I hear against your argument, meaning that that can be countered. For example,
Right.
the cost of production can be countered by lowering the value of the dollar, the cost of, the cost of export, the benefits of export, and the inflation pressure can be countered by lowering the interest rates in this case, which doesn't usually you increase.
Well,
Yeah.
this is something that happens with authoritarian leaders. They think that they can order things that they can't. I think of the president of Turkey, Erdogan, lowering interest rates and then getting angry when that caused high inflation. And this would be a case where, most economists looking at it, things that if, you look at examples in the past, you run models of the present. If you implement tariff, if the United States were to implement tariffs, the likely effect would be for the dollar to get stronger, because you would have, first of all, you would have retaliatory tariffs put on the United States, and there would be just in general less demand for dollars if the U.S. implemented tariffs, because the world economy, the U.S. would be less engaged in the world economy, but there would also be less demand for foreign products, which would mean there would be even a greater fall off in demand for foreign currency. So you'd have a reduction in demand for both dollars and foreign currency. But because the U.S. would be instigating the tariffs, it's likely the fall off in demand for foreign currency would be greater because we'd be buying fewer things from abroad. And if that were the case, then in that, falling of demand, if the fall off for foreign currency, demand for foreign currency were greater, then the relative price of the dollar would go up.
Mm-hmm. And I believe that the administration is pressuring the Federal Reserves to lower the interest rates. Is that the case? What would happen? Because normally, and my very limited understanding is that if you have a inflationary pressure, you want to increase the interest rates. In this case, we will have inflationary pressure from tariffs, but we want to lower the interest rates. Why would that be?
So if we lowered the interest rates, that would add to inflation. It would reduce, that could contribute to a reduction in the value of the dollar. Mm-hmm. Because if people are getting lower interest rates on dollar denominated deposits, that, and it's not people, it's more banks and businesses. If they're getting a lower interest rate on any investments in dollars, then you're less likely to invest in dollars. So you'd have a lower demand for dollars. So yeah, that would be a contributing factor. But given that all the other policies are likely to feed inflation in the immediate and medium term, that it would be an unlikely policy. And unless Donald Trump were to radically change the Federal Reserve's independence, which certainly he could try and could succeed, then the Federal Reserve, with inflation going up, would increase interest rates. However, radically challenge the independence of the Federal Reserve, could lead to a substantial reaction in financial markets.
Mm-hmm. So basically, your predictions are very negative, right? Like you're seeing, all macroeconomics we talked about here are negative, and the most important is short-term inflation for 18 months, and then longer enclosing isolations of economy for the market. So that we will tomorrow we'll see what happens, and we'll be observing it in real time. It's always fascinating. I don't know how economists do that they can predict based on so many variables any kind of outcome. It's magic for me, even though I work in mathematics. But multivariable systems are very, very unstable, very difficult to predict. So one of surprising for many the policies is that we seem to be putting tariffs mainly, well, not mainly, but also on our allies, right? So yes, there were tariffs on China during the first administration of Trump, and Biden did not remove them, so they stayed there. They were not that strong, right? They were not that big tariffs. And now we are also putting tariffs on China, but we're also tariffing Europe especially, and Japan and Korea, which are our allies. Japan is seems to be in state of panic almost around that because they have a huge national debt, and that will hurt them very badly. Also Canada is like very strongly tariffed. So what do you think will be the impact on the relationships with these countries? And let me, before I ask this question, let me try to be a devil's advocate here for a little bit, because I lived in Europe and in Canada, in Europe and in the US. So one thing which I hear, I live in a neighborhood which is 50% the Republican, 50% Democrat, and the Republicans tend to be the working class here. So what they will say like this, after the Second World War, US was in very good position. It was Pax Americana, it was dominating the world, and it believed in the idea of free trade bringing democracy all over the world. That's why Kissinger opened a relationship with China, because he thought that would democratize the Chinese Communist Party by bringing up their wages and people getting rich. And that did happen in a sense. So what happened is Chinese wages went up from like 100 times. It's just amazing how China was lifted from poverty, especially after it joined WTO. That happened also in many developing countries, the Asian tigers, right, who developed their industries. But it doesn't seem to benefit the American worker. The wages stagnated, and people, like when I go to Poland or to France, even better, people have 6 weeks paid vacation, free healthcare, and free education. Here, people have 2 weeks paid vacation, restarting every time they change a job, no free healthcare, and no free education. So it seems like other countries benefited tremendously compared to the US. Maybe the financial elite of US benefited because we have the largest amount of billionaires, but it doesn't seem like average American benefited from the free trade. So I think part of the policy is this, because it's a populist movement, is this idea of leveling the ground for the average American. Tell me why it is wrong, and how these relationships are going to be destroyed, and how it is not going to happen, or maybe you believe the opposite.
Well, it's there. You've touched on an awful lot of things.
Yes, I know. This is not a question; it was a statement.
Yeah, I've lived in the U.S., Canada, Europe, and Japan, so I've seen a lot of different perspectives. But there are many things that are at play. So the thing that I would say is, you're from Poland.
Yeah.
So you may recognize from the Polish experience of communism, leaving communism, joining a single market of the European Union, the benefits that have come from being in a larger economy, from having a European style market economy. And but one can also say not everybody in Poland sees the joining of the European Union as a benefit. There are some critics of it, as you know, but
not because of free market, because of a lack of free market. So free market, Polish win on free market, right? When we create companies where cheaper labor, we win on free market. What happens is that the European Union then counter it by imposing regulations which make it impossible to exercise a free market. That's the criticism, not the opening of the market. We benefit from it. We
Yeah, okay.
benefited
Well,
regardless.
we don't want to go
Yeah.
down this tangent.
Yeah.
I'll go back to this question of working class Americans.
Yeah.
And the point that you've made is an important one. But I think working class Americans often, given the discussion, miss the point that Europe also experienced a tremendous liberalization in the post-war era. And all of the benefits that you talked about that Europeans have, free or at least subsidized health care, university costs being free or much lower than the United States, a much more substantial foundation. Those have all happened within the confines of the post-war liberalization of economies. So where the difference lies is not liberalization, it's the choices that the domestic politics have produced. That the Europeans have produced an economy which has a larger welfare state, which has a social partnership between business and labor. The United States is not. So the issue is within American politics, and I think somebody like Bernie Sanders would make that argument that it's really what's going on at home that is significant. In
So
looking at the
basically,
long,
you just to clear it up, because this is very important point you made. The reason why Europe has all these benefits, it's not that Europe is tariffing incoming goods from US
Right.
and others. It is because their policy choices were made such that they basically created a what some people call welfare state, or at least the basic costs of life, basic costs of education and healthcare are covered by state, right? It's not determined
several
by
choices.
tariffs.
The choices
I
that the
don't know.
Europeans have made have been a much more progressive structure for income taxes. So that gives you more money to pay for a broader welfare state. A value-added tax, which also helps pay for it. So a higher level of taxation in most European countries. And structures that have promoted sort of a higher wage floor. So in many European countries, you have a system of collective bargaining with, this is particularly in Western Europe versus the Central Europe, like Poland. But in Western Europe, you have a collective bargaining structure which spreads higher wages to a far greater degree than you do in the United States. So you have higher value-added taxes, higher income taxes, so a tax base that is much, much higher, more like 40%, or, a place like France, even higher than 50% of your income is taken from you, but you get a return in what the government provides in a more supportive welfare state. The United States is the choice of having taxation that's more like 20%, and you get less because you give less in terms of taxes. And then the social structures underneath, particularly the way the trade unions are structured, in a way that they cover many more workers, so you get less less inequality in the income distribution. So that's what Europe's chosen, and what the United States hasn't chosen. So the question is, can tariffs get that back? And I think the answer is no. One of the things we haven't talked about is implementing tariffs. It does cut off the United States from sources of lower wage costs. And so the question is, how will businesses respond? And I think the answer will be automation. So will it produce jobs? No. Will it mean, extensive more automation, more use of AI? Yes. I think so. This nirvana, this return to halcyon days of manufacturing, I don't think that would happen, even if, we have very high tariffs. I think companies will respond in trying to reduce their use of labor. And one must also note that when you look at in terms of employment, manufacturing is, about 10% of total employment. So you're not going to get back to the 1950s with a third of the economy involved in manufacturing.
I think
Regardless.
this is a great point, and I think this is I think basically the administration is trying to appeal to the base, which is many of the workers, to say there will be manufacturing jobs. But I can't imagine, given we are going through the AI revolution and robotics revolution right now, I will be shocked if there are manufacturing jobs in the near future, in the next 5 years. If you look at the robots and combined with AI today, they are able to do absolutely everything. We don't see it yet because it was not commercialized yet, but in research in labs, absolutely everything. There is no need for labor, so I don't think this will happen. That doesn't mean it will not increase the GDP, because the low cost of production might nominally increase the GDP.
Yeah, but we're going to be a high cost producer as a result of this. So,
Well, will we? If everything
yeah.
is produced by robots instead of
Oh,
Chinese
well,
workers? Yeah.
that's orthogonal to, so that's on a completely different plane, and whether that plays out will, I think it obviously depend on technology. I don't think implementing tariffs will facilitate that. I think it'll
Yes,
create
it's
greater
independent.
headwinds, but it could happen despite tariffs. So,
Well,
so
one thing there, I think, because I was shocked, like when I heard that Apple is actually moving some factories to US, I was like, it will lower their profit margin by like 50%. It seems based on the
but when you
cost.
read the fine print, it's not making iPhones. It's, it's some other things that having to do with basically having to do with AI is what they, when you read the announcement. So it's not bringing iPhones back. And so, yeah, I mean, there's going to be some, there will be some jobs, but I think there'll also be net losses because just things will be priced out. People will buy fewer things because they'll be more expensive. So I think it'll be a wash. The better policy, if you wanted to promote manufacturing, is what the Biden administration was doing, and that is subsidies rather than tariffs.
That's
It's
what
more
China is doing.
targeted. It lowers costs. And so that would have been a better policy, but that's not what they're doing. Trump has this long-standing belief in tariffs. So to your bigger question on, as an American, it's really sad, to see what's happening, because, and it's sad in some ways, and then also just strategically, this is shooting the United States in the foot. And even if the Trump tariffs don't last, the United States built a structure which was before all this happened, which was very beneficial to the United States. The United States did pay for the bulk of the defense of did pay a disproportionate share for the defense of Europe and East Asia, particularly after the Cold War. I think people forget that during the Cold War, countries like Germany and France were spending 3-4% of GDP on defense. And it's only after the Cold War that they built it down. But the United States, yes, had been paying a disproportionate share of defense, But, as the saying goes, he who pays the piper calls the tune. The United States was able, when things happened, to apply pressure on the Europeans and on the Japanese and on others. So you may recall the first Gulf War, the United States applied pressure on Germany, Japan, and Saudi Arabia to pay $10 billion each for the cost of that war, and got it. The United States pressured allies to participate in both Gulf Wars. And the United States has a projection of force. We have all those, we have those strategic bases in Germany and in other places that allow the United States to exert military force through this projection of power. And the question in my mind always was it worth the money? And I think the answer is, yeah, it was. And we're throwing it away. And the second thing, as far as integration, NAFTA was painful when we implemented it. People lost jobs, but we reoriented the economy, and people should have gotten much more support than they did at the time. But we suffered through that pain and gained a more efficient economy, more people with higher paying jobs, although some people, particularly people who were, older than 50, did suffer and were paying the political price for that now. But we gained efficiency through disrupting the economy then. We're going to disrupt the economy and we're going to lose efficiency. And we're going to lose trust. Even if through this experience, like what happened in the 1930s with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, that people learned that was a bad idea, in the same way the British have learned that Brexit was a terrible idea, that a difference here will be that no other country would be sensible for no other country to trust the United States economically, politically, militarily for a good long time. So the United States has thrown away tremendous benefits, both economic and non-economic, that we've had in this regime that we've built up since the Second World War. And we're not going to, those benefits are going to be gone for decades.
I concur what you said, but I wanted to a little bit discuss the actual, like a little bit different perspective. So as Polish, I am forever thankful for US being a beacon of light against the Soviet Union and destroying Soviet Union and freeing Eastern Europe. This is why Polish were so super supportive of US as the only Europeans. The support, if you do the polls in Poland, was 70-80%. In France, it was like 20%. Everybody disliked Americans, right? So this is no doubt about it. But around the time, for at least 5, maybe 10 years, I listened to Polish think tanks on geopolitics, and they all were saying, and I was like, this is impossible, what you're talking about. They all were saying that the world, because of the rise of economy in China, because the balance of power, US is moving to offshore balancing at best, or full isolationism at worst. There is that US will not keep its world dominating power able to defend the world. And was one of the examples was that there is many examples in, but one of the examples is the Ukraine war, where first we did not really help in the fear of, or not sufficiently in the fear of the escalation. Then slowly we did, Biden increased the help up to like sending even F-16s, and now the US seems to be abandoning Ukraine completely. If you think from if you think about individuals, if you try to look at the individuals, you can explain it by character, by but if you think from geopolitical perspective, I don't think US is simply strong enough. Like, for example, in war simulations around Taiwan, the US is losing 9 of 10 times, right? So there is really no way US can be influencing that international politics so strongly as it used to. It's I would love it to be the case. I want the US to be the Pax Americana. We had unprecedented time of freedom and free trade and peace. Of course, there were wars, and the wars, idiotic wars like attack on Iraq.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. There's huge mistakes. But generally, the world experienced the period of peace. But I don't think it is possible to continue. So when I talk to Polish, I tell them, and they are always devastated, don't count on US defending you. And I was saying it a few years ago. You need to build your own military, because you are not going to, there is no way a Kentucky farmer is going to send his children to defend Poland, as they are now not supporting Ukraine. Despite the fact that I'm super pro-Ukrainian, super anti-Russian, in this war it's obvious, there's no doubts, moral doubts about it. In practice, I think it is very naive for Europe to believe they would be defended by US. So what happens in consequence of this erratic behavior? Europe actually realizes that the dream is over. You need to build your own defense. You need to invest. You have 550 million people, or what, even more. You need to build your own army. And if that consequence of the policy will be that they do it, it will be positive, because otherwise they would just lose independence for Russian expansionism, because US would not have helped. I don't believe they would follow the Article 5 of NATO, not to the full degree. So, there are positive, in quotes, consequences of that realization that US is no longer the superpower dominating entire world.
Well, I think there's a question of capacity and choice. And I think the United States would have been able to sustain the capacity of the status quo in Europe and playing the role that it's played in Europe. But it's a question of choice. And I think that what we are losing is the political support. So when we had the Soviet Union as an enemy, that helped preserve the political support. But now that there is no Soviet Union, and the threat of Russia is not the same for us as it is for Europeans, particularly a frontline country like Poland, that you don't have a broad support for the U.S. maintaining this position that it has. But I do think there are obviously the deeper things of just the question of redistribution and wage inequality that I mentioned. There's the social divides that have come in the U.S. as well. So I think we could have maintained it for a very long time into the future, but at this point, Donald Trump managed to find a political coalition that supports him that has rejected it. There has always been in the United States a strong nativist contingent. In the Cold War years were aberrational in keeping that down to a relatively small minority. And in some ways, the 20th century, particularly the second half, is an aberration. When you look at grand historical trends, because of the Cold War and this extreme ideologically driven framework on world politics, and we're returning much more to what is common, and that is sort of national interest, national-based politics. And so I can understand why a country like Poland and Europe in general would begin to doubt NATO. And so NATO, I think, may have been aberrational because of the Cold War. But then one could say, if one hears that Donald Trump desperately wants a Nobel Prize, I doubt he'll ever get one, but I could see having Donald Trump being a candidate for the Jean Monnet Prize as contributors to unification of Europe, because I think no other figure currently is giving a bigger push to driving European unification on a number of fronts than Donald Trump.
That's a good point. There was a very strong internal tensions in Europe against unification. All the ideas of unification, further unification, were rejected by in mass polls and even votes. And now there is definitely a push for European army, European defense, which from Polish perspective is actually not that good, because if what I mean by that is we need our defense on our border. If the decision makers are in Germany, they might sacrifice, as they always did, including US in history, they could sacrifice the Eastern Europe just to appease Russia in their expansionism, as is US right now sacrificing Ukraine. So it could be a next Yalta, right? So I think we unfortunately, as much as we don't want to and don't have money to, as Polish, we need to create our own army and not rely on European army. But in addition, having strong European army would be beneficial because they're close by, they can immediately react, especially at Baltic states will be attacked. And US at this situation, at this configuration, I think will still follow the Article 5 if they are still in NATO, right? They might do it. It's just that it is more realistic, because right now there is prevalent belief that the moment we are attacked by Russia or Baltic states, then US army is literally landing in Poland defending us. That's not happening. This is not even practically possible. We don't have an airport for that. The current government blocked building the only airport that would sustain it. So it would need to come from Germany through Ramstein base and so on. So that takes weeks. So that means the Polish army needs to defend for weeks, which is impossible. So we need to build it, right? But I don't want to go too much to the Eastern European tangents. I just think I agree with you that the distraction of that if US had to step down from being a beacon on the hill and being the dominating power, it could have been done in a way that is much more nice to the European partners. It is too drastic. This is too sudden. It induces too much chaos. Even if it was necessary, you believe it was not necessary. I would love to believe it was not necessary. I just think that the amount of US debt is too high to sustain this dominating power for such a long time. The war's small war in Iraq costed trillions, right? So, it's very interesting what is going to happen. But I'm happy that we also discussed this part because this is all very connected. All tariffs tariffs are kind of like a negative behavior toward your neighbor. On top of it, we have this military withdrawal from Europe. It seems no support for Ukraine. Maybe we'll see what happens. Maybe it's all negotiating tactic, but I start to doubt it. I think it might be, unfortunately, reverse Kissinger, the idea, which will never work, that Russia will be on side of the US against China. Forget about it. You don't understand Russians if you think they will ever submit to any kind of control from the West. Yeah, so we are living in very interesting times. It was fun and calm. Now it is chaotic and interesting, but not safe. So thank you very much for all the discussion and the time you committed to this podcast. I will release it immediately because I want to see the reaction of the people on the tariff discussion and the international politics. And maybe one day we can come back and have a more discussion on geopolitics. I'm very interested in it, and your perspective is very interesting because you are very knowledgeable. I'm just a side observer of that. So thank you.
Well, I enjoyed it very much, and Yeah, we are living in interesting times, and as I said, that's an old Chinese curse, though that's an apocryphal. It really isn't a Chinese curse. It's an
Yeah.
American American statement. But so I very much enjoyed the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you.